Mehdi came home every night to a silent house where the sound of slamming doors and raised voices were no longer part of his daily life. His parents, constantly absorbed by their work and obligations, had forgotten what it truly meant to be there for their son. The house, though large and filled with precious possessions, seemed devoid of emotion. The walls were lined with photos of him looking happy, but these images were now nothing more than a distant memory of a bygone era. He settled into his bedroom, a modest room with faded blue walls, a desk cluttered with textbooks, and an old shelf full of books he'd never had the chance to read. Every night, he did his homework in heavy silence, waiting for someone to come and get him, but nothing came. His parents no longer even took the time to ask him how his day had gone. The television was often on nearby, serving as background noise to fill the void, but it didn't extinguish the pain of his isolation. The worst part was the feeling of being invisible, as if his presence didn't bother anyone. It was this icy solitude that he was beginning to feel unbearable. The outward signs of normal life. At school, Mehdi did his best to hide the emptiness within him. Every morning he put on a mask, that of an ordinary student, calm and serious. He wore his uniform with almost military discipline, his hair neatly styled, his bag always impeccably packed. At first glance, no one would guess that behind this facade hid a tormented soul. The other students saw him as a quiet boy, often alone during recess, but who never caused any trouble. Mehdi settled into class, politely answered the teacher's questions, and carefully avoided attracting attention. He had learned to master the art of blending in. If he appeared too cheerful, it would have been suspicious, so he stayed in his comfort zone, neither too sad nor too cheerful. He watched his classmates, laughing and talking about their days with involved parents, secretly wondering what it was like to feel truly listened to and loved. But beneath this exterior of normalcy, Mehdi felt suffocated. Every smile he displayed at school was a lie he wore like armor to hide his pain. Deep down, he knew his real life was anything but normal. Nights had become a refuge for Mehdi. After turning off the light in his room, he often slipped out of bed, avoiding the noise of the stairs so as not to wake his parents. At that hour, the house was plunged into an oppressive silence, and the outside world suddenly seemed more alive. The street, though deserted, offered a kind of freedom he found nowhere else. As soon as he stepped through the door, he felt freed from the boredom and indifference of his home. The city, under the neon lights of the streetlights, seemed to offer endless possibilities. Mehdi began to frequent places he had never explored before: dark alleys, deserted parks, corners where young people like him gathered to escape the pressures of their normal lives. There he met other boys and girls, often lost souls like himself, seeking to escape the weight of their realities. With each encounter, he felt a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. These nocturnal escapades were a mixture of curiosity and a desire to feel alive, far from his family's indifference. At night, Mehdi was no longer alone. He no longer had to hide his pain. But this freedom seemed, each time, more dangerous and uncertain. The illusion of the good student Mehdi got up every morning with almost mechanical precision, putting on his clean school uniform, his gaze fixed on the mirror in his bedroom. He knew that the day he was about to experience was a balancing act between his role as a good student and his inner turmoil. At school, he presented himself in his best light, neat, calm, and respectful. He had learned to respond to teachers politely and hand in his homework on time, all while remaining in the shadow of the other students. No one suspected that behind this facade of seriousness hid a lost teenager, overwhelmed by emotions he had no one to confide in. Mehdi avoided attention, but his outward appearance of perfection was becoming a burden. He felt that if he showed even the slightest crack in his mask, someone might discover the truth. That behind his calm demeanor, he was drowning in dark thoughts. During breaks, he kept to himself, pretending to read or look at his phone, but inside he felt disconnected from his classmates, like a stranger in a world that didn't understand his loneliness. His role as a good student was merely a mirage, a way to hide the reality of his life. At home, Mehdi played another role, that of a model son, although his family was now nothing more than a facade. In the evenings, after school, he returned to this silent house, where meals were often eaten in silence, each person absorbed by their own concerns. His parents, always busy with their careers, no longer even took the time to ask about his day. The exchanges were limited to superficial questions, like, "Have you studied well?" or "Do you have any homework to do?" But never a real conversation, never a moment of sharing. Mehdi had learned to accept this indifference. He was now nothing more than a discreet presence in their busy lives. Yet, every evening, he made sure everything was in order. He set the table, made sure the house was clean, and waited for the moment when he could disappear into his room. There, he once again donned his mask of tranquility. He didn't dare break this image of a functional home because it was all he had. But deep down, he felt a growing emptiness, as if his existence were an insignificant detail in his parents' lives. The facade of normality hid a darker reality, but Mehdi lacked the courage to confront it. The contrast between the facade he presented and his true emotions was beginning to weigh heavily on Mehdi. Every day he struggled to maintain the illusion of a normal life, but deep down he felt a deep fracture. The pressure to wear this perfect mask, to constantly be who others expected him to be, was slowly beginning to erode him. At school, he smiled, answered questions, and interacted with his classmates, but inside, he felt increasingly disconnected. He had become adept at hiding his pain, but every smile was another cover-up. Every innocuous conversation a reminder of the gap between who he really was and what he showed. At home, it was worse. He felt invisible, like a mere shadow passing without a trace. In his moments of solitude, dark thoughts would overtake him. He wondered how much longer he could go on like this, until the tension between his two lives would burst. But he had no other choice. The mask was all he had to survive. Every day, the gap between the person he was and the person he pretended to be widened a little more. One night, while wandering alone through the dark streets, Mehdi felt a strange pull. The light from the street lamps and the silence of the city suddenly seemed almost comforting. It was as if the world, plunged into darkness, offered a form of freedom he had never known. That evening, something inside him urged him to go further, to cross the invisible boundary he had always imposed on himself. He instinctively followed the alleys he had always ignored during the day. Each step seemed to take him further from his reality, one step closer to the unknown, one step further from the image he projected to school, to his parents. The fresh night air mingled with a feeling of relief. The pressure weighing on his shoulders every day was easing a little, replaced by a new, almost intoxicating feeling. Turning a corner, he saw a group of young people, most of them his age, laughing and talking loudly. They seemed to be in their element, free from any constraints. One of them noticed Mehdi, gave him a knowing smile, and invited him to join them. This simple gesture, this look of camaraderie, awakened in him a desire to be part of this world, a promise of escape, of forgetting everything, even for a few hours. A new world of freedom. The night was becoming a playground where Mehdi finally felt able to breathe. As soon as he crossed the threshold, a door opened onto a world completely different from the one he knew. Here, he was neither the ignored son of busy parents nor the model student hiding behind a mask. The night offered him a freer, more authentic version of himself, far from expectations and imposed norms. The young people he met that first night welcomed him with open arms. They didn't ask awkward questions, didn't try to figure out why he seemed so calm and so lost at the same time. They invited him to participate in their discussions, to join in their little nocturnal escapades. Everyone seemed to live in the present, disconnected from any other concerns. The conversations revolved around things that had nothing to do with school, family, or responsibilities. Mehdi felt accepted, even if it was only fleeting. Here, he didn't have to hide his sadness or insecurity. He could laugh, talk, lose himself in this temporary freedom without thinking about what he would leave behind in the morning. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a normal person, like everyone else. The companions of the night. As the nights passed, Mehdi bonded more and more with the members of the group. He learned about their stories, their own escapes from everyday life, and their reasons for finding themselves here, far from prying eyes. Some were teenagers seeking adrenaline, others, like him, trying to escape family problems. But what particularly touched him was the feeling that he wasn't the only one feeling lost in this world. He found in these young people a form of tacit understanding, an unspoken solidarity that warmed his heart a little. However, in this new reality, he wasn't always surrounded by good influences. Some members of the group led him toward riskier behavior, nighttime escapades where the boundaries of what was acceptable gradually faded. Sometimes he found himself in dangerous places, places where violence and temptation reigned, but he found it hard to resist. Every night, he felt a little more of that excitement that temporarily erased the pain he carried within. He knew these nighttime companions weren't perfect, but in their world, he felt understood. And that was all that mattered to him. The trap was slowly closing around him, but he wasn't aware of it yet. Adrenaline and the full Mehdi's nights were becoming more and more intense. Every encounter, every moment spent in the dark streets gave him a mixture of excitement and thrills. The young people he hung out with offered him thrills, often linked to risky behavior. Whether defying the local authorities, testing his physical limits, or finding himself in situations where adrenaline took over, he felt like he was experiencing something unique, far removed from his dreary everyday life. But with each adventure, a feeling of unease grew within him. He knew, deep down, that the risks he was taking were becoming more and more dangerous. Yet the desire to feel this thrill of freedom outweighed everything else. The rules he had imposed on himself were gradually crumbling. He no longer thought about the consequences. The adrenaline rush had become a kind of drug, an escape from the suffering he carried within. What terrified him at times was the idea that the inevitable fall was getting closer. Every moment of pleasure, every moment of excitement became an illusion, a mask behind which he moved further and further away from who he truly was. The line between freedom and fall was becoming blurred, and Mehdi felt more and more trapped in his own game. Loss of control. Little by little, Mehdi realized that he no longer had control over his life. What he had initially perceived as an exciting adventure was beginning to feel more and more like a spiral from which he could not escape. His nocturnal escapades, once a source of pleasure and adrenaline, were becoming increasingly chaotic. His impulsive and thoughtless choices were beginning to escape him. Each decision seemed to lead to another, and the more he ventured into this world, the more he lost track. The consequences of his actions were multiplying. He had begun to lie more to his parents, to justify his absences or lateness. His grades were dropping, but he no longer spoke about it to anyone. He felt like nothing made sense anymore, and that this double life he was leading was the only thing allowing him to survive. But deep down, he knew this path was leading nowhere. One evening, after a particularly risky outing, Mehdi returned home with a feeling of profound emptiness. He was tired, exhausted by this parallel life. He realized he was no longer able to distinguish the line between what he truly wanted and what he was doing to fill his emptiness. The awakening of consciousness. As the nighttime routine increasingly agitated his mind, Mehdi felt overwhelmed by a sudden realization. During one of his nighttime outings, while walking down a dark alley after a confrontation with other youths, he asked himself the question that increasingly haunted his thoughts. Is this really what I want? The excitement of the moment spent defying the rules and feeling that adrenaline rush suddenly seemed meaningless. Mehdi had always sought an escape from his pain and loneliness, but he realized that despite everything, he hadn't found what he'd hoped for. The truth hit him hard. He had lost himself in this world, and the immediate pleasures he derived from it only served to empty him further. The nights were no longer enough to mask the reality of his existence, and he was beginning to see the cracks in his own facade. He now understood that this double life, despite having sought it from the start, was becoming his worst enemy. He had strayed from his true desires, from what he had always wanted, to be heard, loved, and respected. But realizing the loss was only the beginning of a long road to redemption. Inner conflict. Mehdi felt as if he were caught in a vice. On one hand, he had the call of nocturnal freedom, with its thrills and sense of camaraderie. On the other, he felt a growing emptiness, a painful awareness of everything he stood to lose. Every night spent away from home seemed more and more futile. He could no longer escape the truth. His double life was slowly destroying him. He felt increasingly disconnected from his friends, his family, and even from himself. The lonely moments, when he returned home after a night out, were the worst. It was in these quiet moments that he clearly saw how far he had strayed from who he truly was. The facade he had built around himself was cracking, and Mehdi was beginning to wonder if it was all worth it. He knew he had to change, but he was afraid. Afraid of disappointing those around him, afraid of losing his group of friends, afraid of facing the truths he had long ignored. This inner conflict was exhausting him. Every day he oscillated between these two worlds, trying to maintain balance, but he knew this situation could not continue. The brutal realization. One evening, after a particularly dangerous night, Mehdi had the revelation that changed everything. He had accompanied his friends on an illegal activity, thinking it would be just another challenge, a simple test of courage. But this time, the consequences were dire. The police intervened, and although Mehdi escaped arrest, one of his companions was taken into custody. The adrenaline rush that had once intoxicated him gave way to a feeling of pure terror. It was like an electric shock. Walking home that night, he relived the scenes of that moment over and over again. The panic of the other young people, the fear of being caught, and the realization that he could have lost everything in an instant. He thought of his parents, their disappointment, the image he had always wanted to present, and the life he was ruining. Mehdi realized he was at a turning point. He no longer had a choice. The doors of escape were closing one by one, and he was confronted with the harsh reality of his actions. The fear of permanently losing his future, his loved ones, and himself overwhelmed him. He knew changes were necessary, but the magnitude of the road ahead terrified him. The first step toward repair. The next morning, Mehdi woke up with a heavy heart. The previous day's realization had shaken him deeply. He knew his attitude needed to change, but he didn't know where to begin. The points of reference that had guided him until then were crumbling, and he found himself facing an immense void. He decided to summon his courage and face what he dreaded most, talking to his parents. After several hours of hesitation, he went into the living room where his parents were busy talking. It was the first time in a long time he'd broached a serious subject with them, and his heart was pounding. Without really knowing how, he began, "Mum, Dad, I made mistakes. I got lost in all of this and I want to make amends." Those words, which had felt so heavy, were finally out. His parents, initially surprised and worried, listened to him with an attention he hadn't seen in a long time. It was a first step, modest but sincere. Mehdi understood that he couldn't erase everything at once, but he had decided to regain control of his life. That day marked the beginning of a long road to repair, to reconciliation with himself and with those he had hurt. Shadows of the past. Despite his efforts to change, the ghosts of his past still haunted every corner of his life. Mehdi couldn't erase the mistakes he had made, and these memories followed him like indelible shadows. The moments when he had made impulsive decisions, the lies he had told to hide his double life, all of this came back to torment him. He knew he would have to face the consequences, but the pain of this reality sometimes paralyzed him. The tensions with his parents were more palpable than ever. Although they had accepted his apology and he had begun to reconcile, the trust they had lost wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Every gesture, every word, was now scrutinized by eyes full of doubt. Mehdi felt this constant weight on his shoulders, the inability to instantly repair everything he had broken. School was no exception. The other students had heard rumors, and even though Mehdi tried to focus on his studies, he often felt judged. He felt as if every glance was laden with judgment, as if his past would always be a label stuck to his skin. He now understood that the road to redemption would be long and fraught with obstacles, and that the shadows of the past would continue to haunt him. The return of temptations. As Mehdi struggled to get back on his feet, the temptations he had left behind resurfaced with formidable persistence. His old friends, those with whom he had shared his wild, carefree nights, returned to his life, like ghosts from the past. They invited him to join them, offering them an open door to the freedom that seemed so alluring and exciting, but also destructive. Mehdi found himself at a crossroads. Stay on the path to redemption, or give in to the ease of temptation. The calls from his old comrades became more and more urgent. "Come, Mehdi, we miss you. We'll show you real life, far from all this." Their words, filled with promises of fun and distraction, echoed in his mind. A part of him longed to return to that time when he felt free, when he didn't have to worry about the consequences. But another voice, fainter at first, reminded him of the pain and losses he had already experienced. With each invitation, Mehdi felt an inner tug. On the one hand, he wanted to return to his comfort zone, but on the other, he knew he risked losing everything again. It was a constant struggle between the desire to break free and the will to change his life for good. Reconciliation. Faced with temptations that constantly returned, Mehdi finally made the decision to reconcile with himself and with others. He knew that to turn the page and rebuild what he had destroyed, he had to take concrete steps. The first step in this reconciliation was to reconnect with his parents. He had hurt them deeply, but their love and support remained, even if trust would not be rebuilt instantly. Mehdi engaged in a sincere dialogue with them, expressing his regret and his desire to change. His parents, although still concerned, began to see the sincerity of his efforts. Beyond his parents, he also sought to repair his relationships with his friends. He explained his need to distance himself from their way of life and focus on his future. Some understood, but others rejected him, unable to let go of the past. It was difficult, but Mehdi understood that some people were no longer part of his journey, and that he had to accept this reality in order to move forward. Reconciliation meant not only repairing ties with others, but also finding inner peace. Mehdi realized that true healing came from accepting one's mistakes and having the courage to change, freeing oneself from the weight of the past. Mehdi knew he had to free himself from the shackles of the past in order to move forward, but it wasn't easy. Every mistake, every night spent in the illusion of freedom, remained etched in his memory. To move on, he realized he must first accept his faults and no longer let them define him. He struggled to understand that his mistakes didn't reduce him to a failure, but were part of a learning journey. He began to break the habit of hiding behind pretenses. Sleepless nights spent looking for distractions had gotten him nowhere. By admitting the depth of his unhappiness, he was able to begin the process of healing. Mehdi decided to no longer identify with his flawed past, but to focus on what he wanted to become. To do this, he set clear goals: finish his studies, move closer to his parents, and find a career path that would fulfill him. He sought to understand his passions and define his priorities. The notion of responsibility became central to his life. Every day he took small steps to distance himself from negative influences, while learning to appreciate the simple moments in life. This inner liberation, although long-lasting, marked the beginning of his true transformation. Redefining his relationships. As Mehdi struggled to rebuild himself, he quickly realized that his relationships with others were central to his healing process. His old friends, who had been his accomplices during his nights of wandering, were no longer part of the future he envisioned. He now had to redefine his social circle to surround himself with positive people, those who would support him in his quest for redemption. He began by reconnecting with his parents, whom he had neglected. Each conversation with them became more authentic and sincere. They were ready to forgive him, but Mehdi understood that he had to prove through his actions that he had truly changed. He became more open and attentive, seeking to bridge the gap that had widened over the years. But it wasn't just about re-establishing family ties. Mehdi also sought to forge new friendships based on values of trust and respect. He joined activities that interested him, such as sports clubs and creative workshops, and met young people who, like him, wanted to move away from dangerous paths. These new encounters allowed him to rediscover the beauty of sincere friendship, far from the distractions of his past. The path to self-realization. With his past now behind him, Mehdi embarked on the path to self-realization. He understood that to avoid falling into the same traps, he had to focus on his ambitions and passions. Far from being a simple escape, the quest for self-realization became a real challenge for him. Mehdi sought to understand what drove him deep down, beyond distractions and negative influences. He turned to reading, music, and creative activities, exploring facets of himself he had previously ignored. He enrolled in online training courses to develop practical and professional skills. The idea of finding a job that would allow him to be independent while contributing positively to society became a concrete goal. He realized that self-improvement went far beyond simple academic or professional success, but also involved understanding his values and aspirations. Little by little, Mehdi was building a future he had never imagined. He no longer sought to escape, but to move forward with conviction. His self-confidence grew, and he understood that personal fulfillment was not just a goal, but a daily process. Each step, each positive choice brought him a little closer to the person he wanted to become.